What I'd like to do is to call to the stage our panel for our first session, so on the achievements of MSP in the European Union, 2014 to 2022, as Felix was saying. Olivier Larussini, if you can come to the stage for us, please, Managing Director for Maritime Planning at Sarima. Also, Lenka Humesa Sula, Head of Strategic Spatial Planning Division, Ministry of the Environment and Spatial Planning from Slovenia. From Vision and Strategies around the Baltic Sea, Vasa, we have Olda Nicodemusa. Sorry for the pronunciation, it's like Seamus, I keep getting called Seamus in France, which is very appropriate for this conference, but do excuse me if I'm mispronouncing slightly. Head of the Secretariat, Baltic Sea Region Spatial Planning Initiative, and also from Ireland, close connection to me, Tom Woolley, Marine Planning Advisor for the Government of Ireland. So welcome to our panel. A round of applause for our panel, first of all, perhaps. And actually, what we wanted to do just before launching into our discussion is just to get a bit of a scene setter, a bit of context, if you'd like, from Felix Leinemann from the European Commission, just a bit of a scene setter, Felix, just to set the stage ahead of our discussion. Felix.
Bear with me a little bit more, just to set the scene really for what our discussions in this session could be, the achievements of maritime spatial planning in the EU. On the 13th and 14th of June 2012, a member state expert group on maritime spatial planning held its first formal meeting in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. And this morning, exactly 10 years later, the group met for the 22nd time. So those who were there, bear with me because you will hear some repetitions now. What a decade. In 2012, there was just a handful of member states who had a specific maritime spatial planning framework in place, or who were preparing relevant legislation, and only half of those member states actually had a plan, in the North Sea mostly. A number of member states in the Mediterranean were engaged in integrated coastal zone management for regional and local responsibilities. That was encouraged by the Barcelona Convention, and it was looked at above all from an environmental perspective. In the North Sea, where planning was already somewhat advanced even before the entry into force of the directive, it was rather the increasing industrialization in an overcrowded sea basin with rather small national sea areas that made countries recognize the need for coordinated maritime spatial planning. By the time the EU MSP Directive entered into force, nearly all North Sea countries had an MSP in place, except Denmark. And all those countries now have the second or working on the third generation of plans. But for the very large majority of EU coastal member states, the adoption of the directive marked a starting point. So, from the perspective of the European Commission, this is very easy to say, because we were not involved in specific planning activities. But we are very much aware of the significant efforts that need to be invested in such processes. The establishment of MSP has been a highly resource and time-consuming process, so that all interests could be accommodated. I would like to congratulate all of you for these immense efforts. And as I said in the introduction, Europe is the most advanced and knowledgeable continent on maritime spatial planning. Now, in 2012, what was identified as a challenge in the discussions of the group was the cooperation between member states, because they all had different planning processes with different timelines, etc., etc. And seeing its role as one of a facilitator, the Commission supported cross-border cooperation from the start. And there are projects that we funded before the directive came into being. A first cross-border and regional cooperation project, mainly in the Baltic Sea, was Balt Sea Plan between 2009 and 2012. And then there was also a Plan Bosnia, a project executed between Sweden and Finland and coordinated by HELCOM. So maybe we will hear some of those experiences still. But actually, regional organizations such as HELCOM, WASAP have been very important to stimulate coordinated planning approaches, looking at roadmaps, at guidelines, having regular meetings, and to build MSP communities. We sometimes hear about the MSP family, especially in the Baltic. But the EU and the Commission hasn't hesitated to give a helping hand. Under the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund alone, we spent more than 25 million euros over the past 8 years to fund a series of cross-border cooperation projects on MSP in all sea basins, including the outermost regions. But there's more than just the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund. Interreg, Horizon 2020, so there are other EU funding programs that have contributed quite significantly to these efforts. Had I had the right to show slides, I would have shown this slide where you have all the pictures, but you cannot recognize anything anymore on this slide anyway, so better not do it. Anyway, we also created an MSP community over time. 22 MSEG MSP meetings have taken place since 2012. So 22 meetings of this group. More than 15 of these projects took place with workshops, conferences, and also countless conferences and workshops that we organized over these years with the help of the MSP platform. We can see that in the EU, a really broad MSP community has developed since 2014, and which is going strong despite 2 years without seeing each other. I think that there's a spirit that is there and that's working quite well. Now, the fact that maritime spatial planning is linked to the development of the blue economy emphasizes, of course, the community engagement. It's a way to develop the blue economy in a sustainable manner and including environmental elements. Another element where we've seen a lot of differences over the past years is science and data. Solid planning requires solid scientific research and data. The publication of scientific papers on MSP shows an exponential development since the first decade of the 20th century. Among the publications, the fact that more than 10% of the papers have been published in the journal Marine Policy actually indicates that it is a lot of policy work that is anchored here. And it's not just science for the sake of science, but it is about marine policy. And there's also quite a strong presence of leading authors with government-related positions, more than 11%. Actually, I'm quoting from an article that made an overview of all this. Almost 70% of those publications are case-based, again indicating how much MSP concretely and how practical it actually is. And then the other interesting fact, more than half of the authors leading MSP publications worldwide are affiliated in Europe, with the majority of the reported MSP case studies done within the European Union. So we had something like 39% of the authors in institutions in the European Union, extending to 57% if we look further in Europe with the UK and Norway. So, has there been an added value of the MSP Directive with such processes at EU level? I hope the conference will tell, but I'm, of course, biased, but I would say yes. We managed to set common milestones for all coastal member states, the March 2021 deadline. We managed to have a key driver and accelerator to support the development of integrated maritime policies at national level. The maritime economy has often been driven by sectors and communities, but MSP is a tool to manage the sea as a common good. The directive implementation process has shown that we needed many stakeholders on board and that we need to bring these on board, not only those that were there in the past, like maritime transport, shipping, tourism, but also the ones who thought forever the sea is just for them, the fishermen, but also the newcomers, the energy people. So, with a shift from integrated maritime policy to blue growth and now a new approach for a sustainable blue economy, the MSP Directive can really be seen as an enabler of such processes. We are seeing that broader groups of stakeholders are becoming interested. We are seeing communities of practice emerge and a drive of people to join the process and to learn about it. So this is really bringing people together, and that's what I like about MSP actually, that it really brings us together. So I would like to wish us good discussions, to be aware of the environment that we are working in. I would like us to exchange, and I think I have spoken enough already in this sense, and we'll just hand over to the panel and back to Seamus. Thank you.
Felix, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Felix. It's great to have that food for thought as we launch into our first discussion. It's always really important as well to go on the ground, in the field, as what we say in journalism and these conferences, is really to see what's happening on the ground. Perhaps we can say on the water in this particular case. Let's launch straight into our discussion with our panel. Do feel free to take the microphone as well, so we can all hear what you're saying also for the translation. Maybe we can start with Olivier, and we're talking here about the achievements over that time frame. We heard that time flies. There have been achievements, Olivier. Maybe we could start with just looking at where the process began for you from Sarima's point of view, and how did it go? Just tell us, what was the experience?
Je vais parler en français.
Il faut mettre le casque.
Voilà, équipez-vous. Quand la directive est active, entre en vigueur, où est-ce que nous en sommes en France? Alors je vais remonter un petit peu dans le temps. En 2008, nous avons eu un grand débat national sur l'environnement. Et dans ce débat national, il y a eu un engagement sur la mer, qui était de dire il faut qu'on ait une gestion intégrée de la mer et du littoral. C'est-à-dire alors, on a dit tout à l'heure gestion intégrée de la zone côtière. Là, on élargissait en fait. On disait voilà, c'est toute la mer et jusqu'au grand large, et c'est le littoral jusqu'aux montagnes. Et puis l'année d'après, du coup, on a fait un grand débat sur la mer en 2009, et on a confirmé qu'on voulait ça et qu'on voulait une instance nationale de discussion, des instances de discussion au niveau des bassins maritimes, qu'on voulait faire une planification stratégique intégrée, etc. Et tout ça a été mis dans une loi en 2012. Et donc, quand arrive la directive en 2014, on a le dispositif, le cadre légal, mais on n'a encore rien fait. En fait, on a discuté beaucoup. En parallèle, il y a l'autre directive, celle stratégie pour le milieu marin, qui est parue en 2008 et dont on a mis en œuvre la première stratégie marine. Dans toutes ces choses-là, rien de spatial, pas d'espace maritime en fait. Alors, dans l'espace maritime, dans le même temps, on fait tout en parallèle, on a développé des aires marines protégées à un rythme effréné. En 2007, on n'en avait quasiment pas. En 2014, on avait déjà plus de 20% des zones sous juridiction française qui étaient en aire marine protégée. Et puis on avait commencé à vouloir développer des champs d'éoliennes. Et donc on avait fait 2 appels d'offres en cherchant les endroits où on gêne le moins possible ce qui existe déjà. Et on avait 6 champs d'éoliennes qui étaient déjà programmés. Donc voilà, en 2014, on est là. On a un cadre légal, on a fait des aires marines protégées, on a des champs d'éoliennes, pas beaucoup. On a par ailleurs tout un tas de secteurs qui ont leur propre carte dans leur carton, et voilà, l'OTAN a ses cartes secrètes, les pêcheurs ont leurs cartes de pêche, voilà, mais ça on n'en parle pas. Voilà.
Mais on a quand même vu des résultats relativement vite en fait. On a accompli quelques missions, quelques projets.
Alors c'est-à-dire que c'est ça, quand on voit arriver la directive, on se dit, d'abord, on veut faire notre stratégie nationale, là, mais on ne peut pas ignorer le reste. Donc, on va plutôt intégrer dans notre cadre législatif à la fois la directive milieu marin et puis cette histoire de planification de l'espace maritime. Et donc, on a reformulé tout ça. Alors, c'est très contraignant. La directive cadre pour le milieu marin, quand vous devez l'intégrer quelque part, elle prend toute la place, en fait. Et du coup, ça fait un système très compliqué où on a fait un état des lieux, et puis des objectifs stratégiques, et puis un dispositif de monitoring, de surveillance, et puis enfin un plan d'action. Voilà. Et puis vous allez retrouver là-dedans les différents éléments de la directive milieu marin, mais aussi avec les objectifs stratégiques, on a fait une planification de l'espace maritime. Voilà. Et tout ça est sorti en 2019 pour l'état des lieux, la planification, les objectifs stratégiques, et puis en 2021 et 2022 pour le monitoring et puis pour le plan d'action.
OK. Thanks very much. I can switch back into English. I'm going to ask the same question to Alda. So the starting point for you for the process, and how was it? What was the experience in those early days and taking those first steps?
Okay, so regarding the Baltic Sea region, I suppose that this story is slightly different from the rest of other sea basins in Europe. So we heard already, and it was noted, that Europe is kind of most advanced region in the world regarding maritime spatial planning. But I should highlight that actually Baltic Sea region is a front runner on the European scale. So, and just 1 month ago, the last country in the EU country in the Baltic Sea region adopted maritime spatial plans. That means that all EU member states within the Baltic Sea region have adopted maritime spatial plans. So, and what is behind that success? I should say that in the Baltic Sea region, we started to think about extension of land-based spatial planning towards offshore. And it happened already more than 20 years ago when WASAB Ministerial Conference took place in 2001, and then ministers gave a task to WASAB member countries that it should be promoted and it should be done by projects, and that was a starting point. But initiative came from all at that time, not EU countries, but Baltic Sea region countries. And that actually then started this process of applying for projects. We used Interreg, Baltic Sea Interreg program, and already today it was mentioned this Plan Botnia and Baltic Scope project, but before that there were also Baltic Sea Plan project, which actually helped a lot because people were stakeholders were quite resistant. What's going on? So we are here, fishermen, this shipping sector, and what else should come here in the sea? And but also from my own experience, I can say that these projects helped a lot to start official planning process. That's it. And so I can list several projects which have taken place. So it's really, I think, close to 10, and still we are using this opportunity, this European Commission co-financed projects, and now the most recent is that Baltic Sea region cooperates with the North Sea in EMSP, North Baltic Sea region project. Yeah.
And actually we say that the Balkan Sea region actually a front runner when it comes to MSP. So high expectations now to keep up that momentum for the future, Alda. High expectations. Yeah,
thank you. But also we are happy that several countries like Germany and also Lithuania, so especially Germany had already, I suppose, second or third generation maritime spatial plan, and the rest of countries were learning from Germany. Indeed, and therefore also now we in WASAB cooperation and WASAB Helcom cooperation we have adopted a new roadmap until 2030, and now the change is done from producing maritime spatial plans to implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of plans. Yeah, so we will keep running on that issue. Yeah.
Okay, Alda, thanks very much. So great examples for other countries as well when it comes to MSP. Ireland, Tom Woolley, Ireland, Irish Waters. The starting point for you, what was the process?
So I suppose I'll focus on the formal process, but the first step for us was in 2017, really. We published a roadmap which set out our commitments in terms of high-level aims, how we intended to run the planning process, how we would engage people, and approximate timelines of that in terms of staging. And that came before we actually transposed the directive into law in Ireland, and we actually did that via an amendment to the Land Planning Act in 2018. And shortly between those periods, we actually established a National Marine Planning Framework. The National Marine Planning Framework is the name of Ireland's national plan. We established an advisory group for that. And I think in terms of highlights on the journey, I suppose, as you asked, one of the things that we had right from the very beginning was great government and ministerial buy-in. So we've had a minister chairing our NMPF advisory group from the start, and that really gave weight to the MSP journey in Ireland. And ministers didn't only chair those events in Dublin, they came with us to roadshow events throughout Ireland. They were there at launches, and they were champions of the plan when it went through the Oireachtas, the Irish Parliament, when it was adopted. And it's been in the programme of government as well. So it's had really high level support across government, and that's really helped us in terms of bringing departments together, bringing stakeholders to the table throughout the process. So that's been a really beneficial feature of how we've approached MSP in Ireland. And
okay, so having the roadmap, very important, also that cooperation then. I wonder that same question to others on the panel about cooperation, what Tom was talking there about, the importance of everybody on board on the same page. Does that ring true for you as well, Alda? When it comes to the success for the Baltic Sea?
Yes, I would say yes, but that I didn't emphasize that actually we were lucky that we have in the Baltic Sea region already long run experience working together, like HELCOM. This is convention regarding environmental protection. So it's and also WASAB started this initiative already just after beginning of 90s, and there are two platforms which work at first independently, but then closer and closer, and back in 2010 this common working group was established, and then it's helped a lot for encouraging MSP. And also in this HELCOM WASAB MSP working group, so we invite other stakeholders and to present their views, and definitely via projects it's done a lot, quite a lot.
Okay, so fingers crossed that cooperation carries on into the future. Lenka, let's come to you, that very first question as well. This road that we're on when it comes to MSP, or the sea journey. I shouldn't talk about a road, should I, when we're talking about the ocean. The sea journey we're on, navigating through all of this. What was the starting point for you? How did it go?
Thank you for the question. As already mentioned, the southern European states, or the states belonging to these sea basins, actually didn't have the history we were facing in the northern states, but that doesn't mean that we were not working on the sea. Most of the countries cooperated in preparation of the coastal areas management plans as an obligation deriving from the Barcelona Convention. The difference is that this obligation mostly tackles only the coastal belt. In Slovenian case, it's actually the same, because the aquatory of Slovenian Sea is approximately what we see from the walls of the Brest. So maybe it wasn't that difficult to come from the practice of the Barcelona Convention to the MSP. I would also like to say that when the directive was adopted, we already had several projects in the Adriatic Sea. We cooperated on issues concerning the sea and the use of the sea with Croatia, Italy, and other Mediterranean states. What was brought anew was that we did not have any spatial planning on sea. Before the directive, we only had spatial planning on land, and most of it was in the jurisdiction of the local communities. Of course, we had activities and uses on sea, but they were defined by sectoral approaches. And that's why I think that the Maritime Directive has a big advantage. This is also the only spatial planning legislation adopted on the level of the European Union. It's a hard task, but I think it's important because it's impossible to promote sectoral approach without spatial planning, without stakeholder engagement. It's impossible to have integrated development and sustainable solutions. I would also like to mention that in Slovenia, most of the spatial plans were on the so-called detailed level. So we were forced to go on with strategic spatial planning on sea. It existed on land, but on sea it was of high importance to establish it. And at the end of this initial speech, I would like to say that also in Slovenian case, stakeholder engagement has crucial importance. Unfortunately, in the formal process, it was a bit limited due to corona restrictions, but still, without stakeholder engagement, it's impossible to get to solutions that would have then longer legitimacy. Thanks.
Yeah. And it's true that 2 or 3 years of COVID really did put a brake on things for so many projects. But Lenka, would you say that you saw early progress? Did you see those results? Did you see, a major achievement? I mean, do you have something that you could say was a major achievement for Slovenia when it comes to MSP? Maybe just take the microphone again. If there's just one thing that comes to mind for you.
I would stress this cooperation of different stakeholders.
Similar to Ireland.
Yeah. Adoption of MSP is kind of collateral damage, of course very useful and urgent, but the most important result is this dialogue which was established, and according to the demands of the directive and also otherwise, it will be of great help when we'll have to monitor and of course update the MSP.
Okay, so again, the issue of cooperation, very important. Maybe just back to you as well, Olivier, on that question of cooperation, because we know that in France, we have existing frameworks, existing legal frameworks. How do we go about integrating all of this with what exists already? And what was your experience when it came to that in France?
Alors, je dirais que intégrer ce qui existe n'était pas très difficile. Par contre, on a vécu un mouvement d'élargissement du débat à des acteurs qui ne se sentaient pas concernés par la mer et qui sont venus discuter de la mer. Alors, du coup, on avait des acteurs historiques du maritime qui se demandaient mais qui sont ces gens qui viennent nous dire qu'ils ont une opinion, un avis sur les enjeux maritimes. Et vraiment, toute cette décennie qui amène à maintenant, avec la directive en point d'orgue qui oblige à faire, ce qui est certainement une vertu de la directive, ça a été effectivement l'occasion de développer les parties prenantes. Ce n'est pas seulement les associés, celles qui existaient, mais finalement développer la notion de partie prenante et de voir... alors, on a essayé d'aller jusqu'au grand public, jusqu'aux citoyens. Et là, c'est difficile. Enfin, je pense que personne ne me dira que c'est facile. Ou alors, je suis preneur des recettes. Donc, on a fait, comme d'autres, des jeux. On a été dans des expositions. On a fait des enquêtes sur Internet. On a fait des ateliers citoyens. Et avec déjà une grande difficulté à parler de choses qui sont, somme toute, assez compliquées. Vous parlez d'une stratégie sur un espace maritime qui fait pour la France métropolitaine 330 000 km². c'est très difficile d'en parler aux citoyens. Et puis après, une fois qu'on a fait exprimer des citoyens, nous, la façon de mettre dans nos documents le résultat de cette consultation de ce que les gens ont exprimé, c'est aussi difficile. Et avec une querelle de légitimité entre les représentants officiels des parties prenantes et puis cette enquête auprès du grand public, voilà, les instances instituées ne comprennent pas qu'on aille interroger le public directement puisqu'elles sont là pour exprimer l'avis des parties prenantes.
Et c'est vrai que le lien avec les citoyens, on parle souvent en anglais de citizen scientist, l'intégration de l'expert citoyen dans le processus. Donc ça, c'est très important, j'imagine, aussi en France, comme dans d'autres pays. Tom, peut-être on peut poser la même question à vous, and maybe in English as well, because we're both fellow Irishmen. It's really also, we're talking about the achievements, but the lessons learned. So obviously, during this process, we're seeing what works, we're maybe seeing what doesn't work. What are some of the lessons that you've written down, top of your list, that you want to take forward now when you're looking at how to implement all of this and just in the years to come, the lessons learned?
Great. Thanks, Seamus. Is that it? Okay, great. If I may, can I just come back on a couple of those points?
Absolutely.
I think they're absolutely right. But I would say, and I know it's kind of said kind of as just a saying in marine planning that the process is as important as the plan. And I think both on the data side, on the engagement side, I would say that the marine planning process has been an exercise in increasing understanding amongst people and between sectors. So a big part of the process in Ireland was gathering all the information from all the sectors and bringing it into one format so it could go in the plan side by side. It sounds like a simple enough step if you've got it. But there's all the steps you need to go along the way. So where is the data? Who owns it? Can I publish it? Is it the right resolution for a national plan? All of these things. But in the end, they all go in the plan and you can flip through it and see where things are, and you can go on your digital tool and see where things are and compare them. And I don't think the effort there should be played down in terms of that result and being able to do that in your first plan particularly. And then on the engagement side, I would say, I would agree, I'm afraid, Olivia, I don't have a solution to your perfect solution for public engagement. But I think the important thing is that you involve people and you try to involve people and you use as many different methods as you think appropriate to engage different people in different ways. And I would say, we ran art competitions for school children. We went out to communities. We invited people to out-of-hours meetings so that they could come after work. And there must have been thousands of people engaged in our process. And while not everyone has influenced the plan directly, you can't say everyone had a say in it. I think I would certainly say everyone involved increased their knowledge of what's going on in Ireland's maritime area. And I think that's really positive. And it provides a good stepping stone into the future. So incrementally, I think it will get easier maybe. And so back to your question, biggest challenges. So
lessons learned.
Yeah, lessons learned. Sorry. Skipping ahead. So lessons learned. So I think one of the things that we found challenging was our approach was to do a national plan. Ireland's waters are 7 times its land area. They're fairly, very substantial. But the majority of activities, and certainly the density of activity and the more complexity of activity in terms of number of things going on, is mainly at the coastline. And it means when you're doing a national plan, that resolution, it's difficult to get into specific things that some people want to see in particular areas for some activities. And I think one of the things we have done, it was established at the end of last year, is we've rewritten the legislation underpinning marine planning into what's called now the Maritime Area Planning Act. And what that gives us is an ability to empower any public authority that wants to come to government and say, I want to make a marine plan for a certain activity or for a certain sector or a particular area, for them to say, I want to try marine planning here for this thing. And we as a department will guide that process, and it will become part of the National Marine Planning Framework and feed into it. But I think that is our response to that challenge of it being difficult to put everything in one place, in one document. And so we see that as evolving over time, an organic kind of response to the needs of needing more detail for particular places or for particular activities.
Okay, great, and I love that word organic, things happening naturally. It's always a buzzword in these kinds of projects. Tom, thanks very much. And just talking about public engagement, don't forget you can ask questions on Slido. Maybe we can use Slido when we're trying to get the public engaged when it comes to MSP as well. But don't forget to ask your questions. We're going to leave about 25 minutes at the end of the panel discussion for your questions, so we can address those to the panelists. Olga, on that question of public engagement, I don't know if you wanted to talk about that as well, because maybe that's been important for you as well.
Yeah, of course not on, for our international organization, but member states definitely, so they had to do it. And also I would like to mention that we have in WASAB Helcom, we have developed these guidelines for transnational consultations and public participation. And what I would also like to underline that, like lessons learned, it is clear that this public involvement or informing bordering countries, it should take place at a very early stage when you are developing the plan, so that everybody is who is needed to be informed, and then it's much more easier later to go through all stages and finally adopt the plan. Yeah, but and also these cross-border issues are very important, especially on the sea basin scale. That also for us, the main goal in a new roadmap is to have these coherent maritime spatial plans across the borders.
Did you have an art competition like Tom talked about, a competition where people are doing drawings and things? That could be a good idea, lessons learned from country to country.
Yeah, so we have organized already 4 Baltic MSP forums, and during those forums, so there were these, how do you call these, play, I forgot this name, when you are playing with different uses and that people which maybe...
Role plays, maybe role play scenarios?
Yeah, role plays and just doing this kind of planning, but that people which have not been engaged in that, so they can also easier understand what it is about and how you can argument and justify your proposal, and yeah. So.
I just wondered if anybody wanted to also add something to what Olivier was saying about the existing frameworks we have and how we marry things together. So obviously going from one, it's backwards and forwards, isn't it? It's, bringing MSP into the existing framework, but also vice versa. Any experiences from the other 3 panelists on that you wanted to talk about when it came to that? So integrating MSP into existing legal frameworks, perhaps? And Lenka, that could be a question for you.
I would just like to clarify, are you speaking of legislation or existing planning practice?
I think it could be both. I think things that are important in your countries, that really, if you bring MSP in, they have to be, they have to work in tandem.
I agree. And the first thing we all had to do was to bring the MSP Directive obligations into national legislation. But the harder part, I think, is to bring the MSP Directive obligations into practice. The Slovenian experience was that the MSP does not go over the already adopted plans, but it will now steer all the following, especially the detailed planning acts. So all the regimes that were already adopted stay, but for all the future terrestrial and also sectoral plans, the MSP is an obligation. So all the future uses, all the future arrangements on the aquatory will have to be online or in line with the MSP. And that's why I would use the opportunity to point out that even though we adopted the MSP last year, we are already encouraging all the stakeholders to prepare all the needed expert bases for the new plan. I think that everybody who works in spatial planning knows that the formal process is very short when compared to the length of producing all the needed expert bases. So if we would like to adopt new MSP in 31, we should start to think what we would like to have in it already now.
And actually, that was the next question to the panel was, what is your advice? Because obviously we're on different, parts of the journey, aren't we? Some countries are more advanced. Some countries are taking their early steps. What would be your main piece of advice, Lenka? And I can ask this of the other panelists as well. Your main piece of advice, if you are talking to somebody at the same level that you're at in Slovenia and another country going down this road, what would be your main piece of advice to that person when it comes to implementing MSP?
I would for sure advise what I just said. So get ready with what you would want to have in the plan, and then also.
And in concrete terms, what does that mean? Actually, get ready. What actually would that entail?
For example, if you would like to set a windmill, do your expert basis now, because in our process, at first we established the so-called stand or origin points. And in this document, we wrote down everything we want to have in the plan. And everything that was prepared far enough with all the environmental procedures was ready to go into the process. Otherwise, it was not possible because there was no time in the formal process. And another thing I would like to point out is that we have not finished our work by adopting the plan. We have to do the monitoring and we have to take care for the implementation. And I think these 3 points are the most important takeaway for us. And if I am in position to give advice to anyone, also to any other country. Thank you.
And it would be free advice as well. Free advice from Lenka.
For now.
For now, yeah. Maybe in the future we'll turn that into a business. But great, Lenka, thanks very much. I don't know, we want to go over to some Slido questions just to really take advantage of the fact we have this expert knowledge here to get some responses. But does anybody else want to just add what would be their main piece of advice just before we get the Slido screen up? Don't forget to put your questions in if you have a burning question. Anybody else, main piece of advice, maybe Olivier, yes?
Oui, juste une recommandation, faire attention à ce que le processus formel ne prenne pas le pas sur le fond, c'est-à-dire sur les vrais objectifs.
Yeah, so to make sure that the process doesn't take over the objectives.
Voilà, donc j'ai bien fait la consultation du public, j'ai bien consulté les acteurs, j'ai fait l'évaluation environnementale stratégique. Voilà, tout est bien. Bon. Mais à la fin, en fait, je n'ai toujours pas 30% d'aires marines protégées, je n'ai toujours pas 30 gigawatts d'éolien. Enfin, vous voyez ce que je veux dire. Alors, c'est une difficulté. Donc, c'est une recommandation pour les planificateurs. Et puis, c'est une demande à ceux qui font les textes pour qu'il y ait un peu moins de procédures et un petit peu plus de fond.
Yeah. In English, we say, seeing the woods for the trees, making sure that we can see the trees and we don't just see general woods. We don't get bogged down in the process, but we actually keep really a vision and we keep the oversight and we have the overall perspective. Maybe that's the point Olivia is making. We can see there on the screen lots of questions, and actually don't forget, this is it's with likes. It's like on Facebook. So if we have a question, you put like and then it moves the question up to the top. Which is great. So we have 12 likes for this anonymous question. Regarding capacity building of the MSP teams, how were the planning agencies prepared to conduct the MSP processes? Interesting question. I don't know if that speaks volumes to somebody in particular. I'm looking at the faces now. Tom is reacting. Just move forward slightly. So let's go to Tom on that question.
So I suppose in Ireland, what we did here about capacity was really look to build links and collaboration rather than over-centralize in a single team and into our team. So we saw our role as being the coordinating body, I guess, between stakeholders, between government departments, between science. So we did several things. I've already mentioned the advisory group, and we drew on them to kind of check our progress, see how things were developing. In terms of particular chapters in the plan, we work really closely with other policy leads in different departments. And because while our team was great, none of us were as expert as people have been working, for example, in shipping in the Department of Transport for 20 years, you know. And they know the complexities of those industries, and we need to build them in. So, and then on the scientific and data front, we established a formal connection with the Marine Institute in Ireland, who have a number of very relevant research programs like Informal. So we have almost a complete map of all of Ireland's seabed now, among other research that they do. So they were able to make sure that we had best available knowledge feeding into the process. So I suppose we had the capacity in our team to be able to, because the plan had to be adopted through Parliament and by government at the end of the day. And so our main expertise were around making sure that the drafting was correct, making sure that it was passable, making sure it met all the requirements in terms of SEA, appropriate assessment, those kinds of things. So we had a relatively small team, and I guess what we did was take a collaboration approach to try and plug those gaps where we knew there were holes.
Okay, Tom, thanks very much. I see the Slido moving around a lot as the likes come in. I think the top question has 10 likes. It was a different question just a while ago, but let's just go with this very top question here. And it's changed. This is live. This is great interaction, isn't it? It's actually as we speak, and it's the public that decides. So it's democracy in action as well. Let's just read this before it disappears. What could be the potential levers to accelerate the consultation implementation process? So what could explain the difference, and I like the French touch there, just to make sure that it's bilingual, of progress amongst the different MSPs, I think it should be, or the MS. Who would like to respond to that question? So leveraging all of this, accelerating that consultation, the implementation. I don't know, Olivier, could that be something that you could talk about? How we're leveraging that? I don't know if we can go back to, yeah, it's the second question there now.
Non, je n'ai pas d'idée, mais ça fait écho à ma remarque sur le processus formel. Il est effectivement, alors on peut vouloir l'accélérer. Alors mon expérience serait de dire, ce qui compte le plus, c'est la consultation à l'amont, c'est-à-dire dans les stades préliminaires, quand les choses sont assez ouvertes, où on discute de vision d'avenir ou de choses comme ça. Et qu'à la fin, les consultations qui nous prennent des mois, elles ne servent à rien, parce que de toute façon, on ne va rien changer. Enfin, je vous le dis honnêtement, ce n'est pas possible. Si on change quelque chose, il faut recommencer. On perd 6 mois. Ce n'est pas possible, on ne le fait pas. Donc, oui, une façon de, finalement, à la fois d'être plus honnête dans la participation et d'accélérer le processus, ce serait de faire plus de consultations à l'amont, avec toutes les parties prenantes.
Est-ce qu'on voit quand même une grande différence, comme on a posé la question ici? Ou est-ce que pour vous, en France...
Non, la différence entre les pays membres, les États membres, je pense que ce n'est pas ces processus de consultation, c'est beaucoup des questions politiques aussi. Enfin voilà, je pense que vous avez aussi besoin du portage politique. Vous pouvez faire un travail technique, même de concertation très important. Je crois que dans l'exemple de la Suède, l'agence avait produit la proposition de plan et il a fallu du temps avant que ce soit accepté. Je crois que dans l'exemple des Pays-Bas, c'est pareil. Entre le moment où le travail a été fait et puis il a fallu franchir toutes les étapes d'accord politique, ça a pris du temps. Chez nous, c'est un peu pareil. On n'a pas eu forcément au départ le mouvement qui poussait, et beaucoup d'opposition à la planification spatiale en mer. Et si vous n'avez pas un portage politique, voilà, on n'avance pas, on prend du temps. Et donc, mais ça, je pense que c'est très lié à la situation dans chacun des pays. Vous avez mentionné l'histoire, si dans la Baltique, ça va plus vite, c'est probablement parce que ça a commencé beaucoup plus tôt, parce qu'il y a eu des intérêts localement, des enjeux, des envies de faire. Et voilà, c'est pas parce qu'ils sont meilleurs dans le nord que dans le sud.
Okay. Olivier, thank you very much. And by popularity, the question there on the cross-border issues, great question that comes up often in these discussions. How cross-border issues... Sorry, Tom, you wanted to just respond to what Olivier was saying?
Yeah, I just really quickly, just looking at the phrasing of the question, reminded me of some feedback we had during our process. We tried quite hard to use social media to raise awareness of things we were doing and to engage people in what we were doing, but we still got criticised for not doing enough or using the wrong platform and those kinds of things. And I guess it comes back to that skills and expertise question previously. I think we could use social media better and probably more effectively somehow. How that would be used in a consultation context, I'm not sure. But certainly at the very minimum, better awareness raising and those kinds of things, but perhaps to gather information as well. But I don't disagree with Olivia's point that actually the gears that grind slowly are the political ones, and those take time, and that's just what happens in the process.
And especially when you have the social media giants based in Ireland, there should be no excuse getting the social media situation sorted out. Thanks very much, Tom. Let's just go to that question there on the cross-border issues. So how were these cross-border issues considered by each country in the MSP design? What was, or could be looking to the future, the role of regional organisations to ensure consistency? And there we see the Brittany Regional Council heavily involved there, good example. Does that speak to somebody on the panel, that question, the cross-border issues? And also the role of regional players. So it goes back to that question of cooperation, of getting everybody on board, making sure that you have input and engagement. Who would like to talk about that? Lenka?
I would like to stress the importance of informal cooperation among states which border also on land and on sea. And I think that also the cooperation within, for example, the macro-regional strategies is useful. This was the case before the formal directive obligations in Slovenia, and I think it's okay. But maybe we had easier work because there were no really big development needs when we were preparing our first MSP, and that's why it was not so hard to find compromises. Namely, the protection regimes are very strict in Slovenia, so the water protection, the nature protection, and in this first MSP we only have some minor development needs, and they were then not so difficult to be placed into the plan and won't be difficult to be realized in the concrete space.
And actually, I see there the question that got 4 votes, but actually tied to this, so the multi-level cooperation, local regional authorities in the implementation, but also the monitoring process. And somebody brought that up before as a very important point when it comes to monitoring. I forget who that was. Was that Tom? Alda, talking about the monitoring. Maybe you could just add something on that point. So it's linked to this multi-level cooperation, but maybe particularly when it comes to monitoring, so having that consistency that the first question talked about.
Yeah, so I'm afraid I can't yet give the correct answer to that, because we are going in the Baltic Sea region to monitor how existing approved plans will work. And we heard already this morning in the MSP experts groups that, like, for instance, Sweden will in a very short time have to make new proposals for the adopted plan, but it mainly regards to offshore wind energy replacements, placements. But
So these are next steps,
yeah,
obviously, the
yeah,
monitoring.
monitoring, yes, but
Yeah.
definitely it should be done, because I remember that some people ask what would happen if there would not be maritime spatial plan. So what is difference? So, and therefore we have to prove it.
Any other extra thoughts on monitoring, just while we're on this topic? It could be interesting to go down that path. If not, and we have talked about this, but maybe we're looking for more details here. And, one of the questions could be, what has been really your best example of this? We had the art competition in Ireland, but how did member states engage stakeholders? So all stakeholders. And often, we think it's quite a short list, but actually when we dig deeper, we find that it's enormous. It's a long list, so they're just the example of fisherwomen perhaps as well, from neighboring member states. Okay, so it comes back to that question of engagement. So, and also cooperation. Does anybody want to talk about this? I mean, it is a long list, isn't it? Of, Olivier, perhaps you can talk to this, the long list of people that we have to engage with, that we have to make sure they're on that list. Tom spoke about that as well, but France's experience on this question.
Donc, pour les parties prenantes des pays voisins, pour être honnête, on s'en est pas occupé. Voilà.
Est-ce qu'il faut le faire? Est-ce qu'il faut le faire quand même?
Alors, j'aurais pu vous répondre. En bon fonctionnaire français, nous avons consulté, selon les procédures de la Convention d'Espoo, les pays voisins qui avaient la charge de consulter leurs parties prenantes et qui pouvaient nous demander éventuellement d'organiser cette petite patata. Non, voilà, on ne s'en est pas occupé. On a eu l'occasion, il faut le dire, grâce au projet financé par la Commission de coopération, justement, d'organiser des ateliers en commun de parties prenantes. Je pense notamment à ce qu'on a fait dans l'Atlantique. Et donc, voilà, on est dans un cadre informel, tout est possible. On ne s'occupe pas justement de savoir si on est dans le processus formel et si on n'a pas fait quelque chose que le ministère des Affaires étrangères réprouverait s'il était au courant. Donc voilà, on est dans un cadre de projet technique. Et là, on a eu des vrais ateliers avec les parties prenantes, en l'occurrence Espagne, Portugal principalement, dont j'ai ce souvenir en tête. Voilà. Mais pour répondre honnêtement, oui, à améliorer.
Work in progress. I love that term at these conferences. Great answer anyway, Olivier, on that point. 10 likes for the next question, and we go back to older here. We did touch on this, but maybe we're looking for more detail here. What is the secret? What is the secret in the Baltic Sea region? Why is the Baltic Sea region so advanced when it comes to MSP? We talked about this together last night at the drink with some of your colleagues, but it only seems interesting to see your answer. So what are some of the main drivers this person here with this question is getting at?
Yeah. So these will be just assumptions and maybe a kind of speculation, but I suppose that people which were represented the WASAB community and also in HELCOM communities, they understood the seriousness of that new sea uses are coming and that something should be done already at that 20 years ago, that that it's not only fishermen and sailing taking place and the shipping.
And you already had this structure in place, so for decades you had this structure in place, and you could just take that and use it for MSP.
Yeah, and also for these platforms, so there are regular meetings took place, and also but it happened later on, these planners or planning forums were organized, and these were platforms where very practical things have been discussed, and identification of problems, and then countries shared experience how they cope with such problems and challenges. So just learning from each other, I think, and very good cooperation, and also responsible people live in the Baltic Sea area.
So there's the secret recipe. And free advice as well from Olga. Thank you very much. 11 likes for the question about energy targets. I don't know if that's a specialty for our panel. We can ask the question anyway. Can MSP keep up with marine energy targets that are being driven by the energy crisis? I don't know if Tom's leaning forward. That's always a good sign.
I'll try and keep it short so that someone else can come in on this one too. But just coming back to something I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons that as part of updating the legislation that we did last year, as I mentioned, we've created an opportunity to make sectoral or subnational marine plans under designated maritime area planning processes. And one of the things that we think is going to come forward first in that process is a plan for offshore renewable energy in Ireland. And because it's a framework, it will sit nested within the existing national framework. So what we've done is recognise that these changes are coming, and not just for energy, but for other things too. And the new legislation gives flexibility to respond to that. So rather than revising the whole plan and going through a whole planning process again, you can create kind of amendments, if you like, to the existing process. So we hope that that's a sufficient response to kind of try and keep up with the energy targets. I suppose the other thing you can do, no, I'm going to leave it there and hand it over to someone else.
Yeah, and it's a work in progress as well, so that's the interesting thing. Anybody else on the panel who wanted to talk about energy targets, respond to this question? Because there's another question, and actually last night somebody told me, actually, Seamus, you know that the conference is now about forests and trees. Nice little joke just to make sure that I was on my toes. We can adapt, can't we? But it's interesting because we do have this question here about land-sea interaction. And I said, even if we talk about trees and forests, I would be able to make it work and I'll be able to talk about that. But this question, have you run into land-sea interaction stories which you did not think of in the pre-planning phase of your processes? So this is a question from somebody who's on a later panel, actually. So a bit of a sneaky question coming in there, but a good discussion to be having. Is it important for you? I don't know, Olivier, I think we talked about this briefly when we were planning for this round table. The land-sea interaction, is that important for you? Is that a buzz phrase?
J'aime beaucoup la façon dont la question est posée. Alors je dirais que oui, j'ai deux histoires à laquelle nous ne nous attendions pas. La première, c'est que nous avons un système de planification, comme je vous l'ai dit, mer et littoral. Si on coupe la forêt dans le Limousin, ça a un impact sur la mer et on doit en tenir compte. Voilà. Donc la première surprise, c'est que en ayant intégré les deux directives dans nos législations et dans nos processus, on a complètement oublié la terre. Parce qu'elles étaient marines, maritimes, et on a complètement oublié la terre. Et donc en fait, on sait qu'au deuxième tour, il va falloir qu'on fasse un effort. La deuxième histoire, tout aussi surprenante, c'est que on a découvert, enfin moi en tout cas, j'ai découvert que le bon état écologique ne pouvait pas forcément être le même pour la directive 4 sur l'eau et pour la directive 4 stratégie pour le milieu marin. Et alors ça, c'est très surprenant pour quelqu'un qui n'est pas spécialiste de ces directives.
Okay, anybody else want to talk about that issue, the land-sea question? Yeah, Lenka.
In Slovenian case, the land-sea question is extremely important because everything that happens in our aquatorm is actually a land-sea interaction. And the problem is that the state is responsible for planning on sea and the local communities are responsible for planning on land. But on the other hand, in this narrow coastal belt, it's of course natural that the state will not plan minor arrangements. And it is of utmost importance to find this compromise, who plans what, and also that the MSP will not limit the local communities too much in their development needs. So it is important. And I would like to mention one ESPON project that was carried out a few years ago, tackling land-sea interactions. It was a useful experience. but there are many different. So each country, each territory must find out which, let's say, interactions or which activities are relevant. And when I'm already speaking, I would like to tackle also the question what comes first in MSP, environmental needs or the development needs. I think that most of spatial plans are derived by development needs, but it is impossible to make them without taking on board the environmental measures. That's why we always have to do, besides the spatial planning, also the environmental impact assessments, and by this take care for the good environmental status. Sometimes this is very difficult, and if we will try to get to the energy targets, maybe we will have to rethink all the other targets. But of course, only to the extent that the environmental status won't get worse.
Okay, so there's a lot of work to be done, in the years ahead. I see we have another question here. We have time for just one more question. Don't forget that a lot of these questions, I see one there on climate change, for example, these can come back in future sessions. So we're talking about renewable energy, we talk about climate, we talk about data, we can also talk about marine protected areas, the importance of that. So don't worry if we didn't get to your question, if it didn't get many likes. In future sessions, we can look at those. Maybe just one quick little question here, which had 11 likes, which is on the data. And there's a quote, and I'm presuming it comes from an MSP directive or plan or kind of guidance. Member states shall organize the use of the best available data. How this condition has been regulated so far and by whom? That could be just like a little teaser, if you like. This is going to be discussed in a session after our coffee break. But maybe just if there's just a thought on that from this panel, if anybody wanted to just touch on this, the importance of data even, the sharing of knowledge, the sharing of data. I know that data is a little bit of a sensitive issue for some countries, but just that sharing of expertise when it just comes down to it. Olga.
Yeah, so I would not tell about any particular country, but again, I have to tell about Helcom WASAB initiative. So we have data experts subgroup under this working group, and so they work very hard, and they are trying to put together different data from different countries. So it's already there are results of output data and input data, but also this cooperation between states and regular meetings and exchange of knowledge and trying to do the best that these databases are compatible. So it's again, I suppose that there should be some coordination between countries.
Yeah, and sometimes we say we should take away the word data and talk about expertise and sharing of knowledge, because that seems a little bit more accessible for lots of different parties. So thank you very much. It is time for our coffee break. I'd like everybody to give a round of applause to our panel for all of those great answers.